Okay, so now we're going on to the panel discussion, and we've got around about, I don't know, 30 minutes, I suppose. So that will take us to, I don't know, 12:05-ish, I hope. And we've got some wonderful people who have agreed to stay with us as our panel members to discuss the fascinating and potentially controversial topic of, can companion animals in modern domestic situations live a good life? And so sharing some of their thoughts around this with me will be, let's have a look. We've got Helen Beattie. You've met Helen before. She's the Chief Veterinary Officer for the New Zealand Veterinary Association. There she is. I don't know which way around on your screen she is, but there she is. Dr. Bidder Jones, she can wave to you. She spoke to us yesterday about a good life for horses. She's the Chief Science and Strategy Officer for the RSPCA in Australia. Dr. Susan Hazel from the University of Adelaide. Thank you, Susan. Associate Professor Nio Beausoleil from Massey University. And Dr. Anya Dale, Chief Scientific Officer of the SPCA in New Zealand, who you've just met. So welcome to you all. Hope you're ready for some good conversation. You've got your mics on, and off we go. Unfortunately, to those who are watching, we won't have time for questions and answers during this session. We've only got a short session. But if you've got a query for any of the panelists, you can put that in the question and answer box, and we'll try and get those answers to you later on online. But please specify which panelist you would like the answer to come from, otherwise you'll get an answer from everybody. So our main question, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists in turn the same question. In their opinion, can or do companion animals live a good life? And I will start this because I've got the screen here with Susan.
Thank you, Nat. Yes, I think they can, but one of the key things that we can do to help them to live a good life, I think, is to let them have their preferences, what they want to do, what choices they want, and not what we as humans think is the best thing for them. So rather than trying to make them fit into our lives, we need to fit our lives around them.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. That was good and also quite succinct, which means we've got a lot more time for discussion. Helen.
Kia ora katoa, everybody. So I entirely agree with what Susan has said. The notes I'd made were quite like marrying stamp Dawkins. Do they have what they want and what they need? So if we break that down into those two pieces, we understand what they need through understanding how they need, what nutrition they need, all the stuff that Natalie's just talked about. Shelter, water, normal behaviours, a whole bunch of things that we kind of inherently we're working in and around all of the time. We then need to consider what that need looks like from a minimum standards perspective, which is how we're regulated and what the law says versus what we think and probably most of us believe they ought to be getting, which is opportunities for positive welfare. So that need thing actually needs some drilling into to understand what we're talking about there. The want thing, of course, becomes very interesting because, and I think in some ways it becomes an ethical debate, and we need to get bioethicists involved to have this conversation, because ultimately what Susan said is, it's around preference and helping them experience life through their needs and wants and all of the things that they find particularly attractive. So for a dog, running, roaming, jumping, humping, fighting, barking, and none of that's really what we consider to be a socially acceptable dog necessarily. So something has to give there, and that becomes a conversation around, do they need to fit in our society and meet our needs, or are we going to enable them to live their best life, and where's the happy landing around that?
Yes, thanks. Yeah. Okay, Anya, on to you.
Thank you, Nat. So yes, shortly, succinctly, yes, I think they can have a good life, but there's just some key issues that I think that can actually enhance it. So I think that as companion animal guardians, I think we need to have a better understanding around our body language of our companions so that we can better understand them. We see a huge amount of misunderstanding and negative consequences occurring. And so when we've done research looking at can people and owners and different types of veterinarians, trainers actually interpret body language, there doesn't seem to be a very high degree of being able to interpret correctly. And I think that poses some risk from a welfare perspective. with our animals. So I think we need more education for our animal owners in terms of making sure that they're correctly understanding the body language. And as Susan said, the interaction is on their terms. I think regular veterinary care, whole of life care is so critical, right from an early age, right through to, as Natalie pointed out, particularly in that geriatric stage of life as well, which is so critical in terms of the welfare of these animals. And then just the last point I'd like to make is being able to actually provide our animals with meaningful positive experiences, and that is really, really important. It's not okay just to remove things. It's what they need is positive experiences in their life. And that can be done in a multitude of different ways, and a lot of the speakers throughout the conference have touched on that. So I think that that's really important. We need to look at positive welfare outcomes for these animals in our care. Thank you.
Thanks, Anya. And Ida.
Thanks, Nat. I want to bring it back to what Susan was talking about, and particularly just now, but also yesterday in terms of agency. When I was walking my dog this morning, had her comments ringing in my ears. So I thought, oh, let's see how this works in terms of where he goes. Choosing how long he spends sniffing at the last dog that had peed on the corner. It was a really, really slow walk. But and then I took that thread and I thought about how that would work with horses. And I think one of the key issues for horses living a good life is the lack of agency that we give them. In fact, most competitive equestrian sports are all about, and even recreational riding training of horses is all about control. So it's actually about taking agency away from horses. So I think we actually have a lot of work to do to really make sure that we do as much as we can to give horses a good life. The time when they have the most agency is when they're turned out in a paddock, when they're with their social companions, hopefully not on their own. And as long as they've got, enough food, enough care, and enough space in that environment, I think they probably do have a pretty good life. It's when we take them out of that paddock and we start to interact with them. And a lot of horses, when they're in competitive situations and in sport, they're spending a lot of their lives in situations where they've got very reduced agency. And then also we're coupling that with using a range of different aversive devices on them, things that either cause them discomfort or pain or restrict their movement or their perception in some way. So I think we've got a long way to go in terms of horses to make sure that we are able for them to live a good life.
Thanks, Beda. And Naya.
Well, I would just start off by saying great minds think alike, because most of the things I was going to say have been said by these other wonderful people. So I would concur entirely. And I guess I want to make a plug, and I'm probably speaking to the converted, about using a framework that allows us to look systematically at the lives of our companion animals. And the good thing about that is that we can apply it to any species, and we can use it in a way that's appropriate to the species or to the taxon that we're considering, so that we can really think about what is a good life for this animal. And I love the point you made, Susan, that it needs to be their good life, not ours. And I think one of the challenges is that we love these animals so much, but our love turns into something that means that we're giving them the good life that we want them to have, and through our lens, not what the good life would be for them. So I'm kind of thinking of the handbag chihuahua as an extreme example, So there's absolutely no lack of love or thought or consideration for that animal, but what a good life is for that animal is considered through the owner's lens, and that's a challenge, and it really manifests itself when we think about things like animals living without social companions and having no agency and being unable to do those things that make a dog or a cat. And quickly, the other point I wanted to make was I think I'll make this point again, is that it's really swings and roundabouts. So when we provide animals with certain kinds of lives, we fulfill their needs and their wants in some dimensions or some domains, particularly domain 1 with nutrition and domain 3 with looking after their health and their physical state. But it's in domain 4 where they get to express their agency and do the things that they want to do, that the compromise is often made. And so I saw a comment yesterday in the Q&A about stray cats versus owned cats. And I guess I would make that point is, an animal that has less human interaction may have less of its needs or its wants met in domains 1 to 3, but has full agency in domain 4. And so there's trade-off depending on what your life looks like and the degree of human interaction. And that's a challenge to try and maximize or optimize welfare in all of those different domains, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you. Some really good sort of thinking, and as you say, great that there's some, similarities in what you're saying in relation to preference and choice and agency. I suppose all different words, sort of trying to really, talk about how important it is for the animal to be able to have some control over, the sorts of things that it wants and needs, and we have to see the world really through that species and that individual's eyes as well. So they're all really good points. So I have a question though. So what's interesting is, and I'm going to put this, I think, I'll start with Susan, I think. So you talked about choice, but I'm thinking about this, that a lot of the time owners think that they know what the animal should have or wants or needs. And I'm thinking about this in relation to animals that perhaps don't conform to what we think a good life should look like for them. Cats are a really good example. You're always hearing about people who want to have cats in large groups and they'll be lonely if they're on their own. And then you hear about people who often think that it's really important that a bitch has, a litter of puppies and, those sorts of things. So what do you think about that, where, that people are kind of putting their own view on what an animal needs or wants?
I think that this touches on the area of human behaviour change, which you included in your great introduction yesterday, which is the hardest part of the equation for really improving animal welfare. You may occasionally see my little rescue puppies popping up on my lap. This is where she likes to be. So I think it's not a simple solution to change that, but it needs education across the board in as many ways as we can to try and inform people about what animals do really need, and that it's not necessarily what they think. And the more we can do that, the better. So I touched on yesterday, we're doing a survey at the moment on exploring cats. And so it's something that came up because it seems to be a bit of a phenomenon on social media where people are taking cats out exploring, and we were intrigued to find out more about it, and we haven't analysed the results yet. But I think for some cats, it's a fantastic experience. It enriches them. They enjoy going out. They've been well socialised to going out. But for other cats, it may actually be the worst experience possible. So I think social media exacerbates some of these problems, because what people think an animal needs can sometimes be what's going to look good on social media. And you talked about the example of the chihuahua in a handbag. Was that Unayo who mentioned that earlier? And I watched a conference on aggression in dogs on the weekend, and they showed in social media where dogs are shown with aggressive behaviours because people really like watching it. And a lot of those were chihuahuas. So there are so many problems, not an easy solution, but we've got to work with psychologists, we've got to work with social scientists to really look at that human behaviour change in attitude.
Thanks, yeah. And another question that just came from what you were all talking about, again, sticking on the theme of choices, and Bidder, I like the fact that you decided to explore this with your dog this morning. But I'm thinking about this in relation to the keeping of pets or being companion animal guardians. And often, people would like to make choices. And and they're not necessarily choices that are particularly good for them. I'm thinking about eating chocolate every meal, you know, which is what I wanted to do when I was a kid. You know, when I'm grown up, I'm going to eat chocolate every meal. You know, not particularly good for your teeth or your weight or anything else, or your diabetes. But there are situations, surely, where animals, you know, might have a choice they want to make, Bidder, but it's not necessarily a good choice for their welfare or their long-term quality of life. And it may well be a choice that if they can't make it, really it might not be that important because there are other things that might compensate. Do you sort of accept that or have a different view?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's obviously what preference testing is all about when we're trying to work out what animals would choose to work hard for and what they will you know, don't appear to need to do. And yes, we know that you know, most companion animals would probably have a pretty awful diet if they got to choose it themselves. And just going back to my dog, he's a senior dog, so he's on a restricted diet, very, very careful because of his kidneys. But he chooses to eat wombat poo just about every morning when he goes for a walk. So I have no idea whether that's a good choice for him, but it's very hard to stop him doing it. So I think you're right in that in the environments that we keep companion animals, there are going to be choices that they will make that will be inappropriate for them. But on the whole, I think our concerns need to be about understanding what it is that they, you know, we've got to help them make the choices, but we've got to give them the choices. So that's really what it's about, is understanding, you know, as Susan said yesterday, and we talk about this with our work around cat containment in Australia, ensuring that if we make a choice to contain a cat indoors, which we're doing for the safety of the cat, plus a trade-off between the cat's impact on the environment and the, you know, cat's own ability to roam, like we're having to make that trade-off, then we've got to make sure that within the environment we give them, they've got the choice that they need. So they have options of where to sleep, options of where to feed, options of where to litter, and options of where to, you know, the views that they can have in that environment, and hopefully somewhere that they can go outside as well, but in an enclosure. So we've got to take responsibility for finding out what the right choices should be and to offer those.
Thanks. So, Helen, do you think, therefore, that it's always going to be a bit of a compromise, you know, when we have companion animals in our lives that really, I mean, you've pointed out you can't have animals that just go around doing all their natural behaviour all the time, because in fact it probably wouldn't be appropriate or accepted, or in fact we probably wouldn't keep companion animals.
The short answer is yes, life is a compromise, Natalie, as you know. So that applies whether you're a human type or not. Yeah, and I mean, this is, as I say, it becomes an ethical argument, right, around how do we find that balance point around what these animals want versus how we want to engage with them and how they're expected to behave and be part of our society. Because we need to remember also that, you know, there's a massive education piece in there as well. So per Anya's comment, if we're seeing animals do perfectly normal behaviours that people just don't understand being perfectly normal behaviours, you know, rushing the gate because someone walks past, it's a normal behaviour. I'm not saying, you know, don't necessarily want to modify that behaviour, but we need to recognise it for what it is. So there's a whole bunch of things sort of behind the how we find that happy medium, including education, and across the sector. I'm talking from veterinarians through to companion animal guardians and the general public as well. So if they're walking up and down the street, they can actually recognise that behaviour is normal, and you know that potentially is going to end up with better outcomes for animals if there's not complaints made and they're not called rushing dogs that are then dangerous. You know, so the implications are really broad if we don't understand what it is we're talking about and how we want them to engage. I just wanted to pick up on one thing that Susan said too. Many years ago, I went and listened to Kirsty Sexel talking about some behaviour and yada yada. And she said, one of the interesting things that we don't really consider very well in veterinary medicine is that from a human perspective, and I'm interested that we're drawing so many analogies from humans, right? Because this is part of this whole conversation around how we're so aware now that our sentience and positive affective states and so on is so much how we experience the world, that we should give animals the same credit for, you know, being able to have a similar experience. If 1 in 5 humans experiences mental dysfunction in some way, shape or form, so anxiety through to complete agoraphobia to fireworks phobia, whatever, why would we not expect that actually animals have a similar 20% of the population struggle with things? So following that through, she gave an example about how there was a dog that was so anxious leaving its property that it was her dog, that she gave it an enriched environment on her back section, and it was a big dog, because her belief was that provided a better quality of life for the animal versus what she had bought the dog for, which was to get her walking on the street. And that's her walking on the street, right? Not the dog, is what I just said there. So, you know, I don't think we've really engaged in those types of concepts very well in this as well. These animals are not an amorphous population of well-rounded, happy beings. Neither are any of these panelists, I would say. we're all a bell curve, right? And so we need to start thinking about it from that perspective as well, going, some of these animals' preferences are additionally affected by their psychological capability, all those things that impact their psychological health. And that to me is just a massive big field of, you know, stuff. Well, no, you might know how much work has been done in that area, but it seems to me like an untapped piece that we haven't really started to address in any true sense at this point.
Yes, and especially if I don't know whether some of you may have been listening in at the beginning of our conference when our Minister for Agriculture suggested that we should also be looking at bee welfare. And I think if we looked at every single individual bee's welfare, that might actually be extremely challenging. So yes, I don't know. I'm sure they all have very different preferences.
I think it's just winding up.
No, that's actually, there was in the Beekeepers Journal this month, he's talking very passionately about it. So Anya, I'm going to ask you a question that I suppose you would be the best person to answer, given that you work within an SPCA, a big SPCA in New Zealand, and you see a lot of different species of animals that are being kept as companion animals. So the question is, given everything that we've just said about choice and limitations, particularly when in the world of humans, what are the species, or are there species that you just shouldn't have, that you can't provide a good life for?
That is a great question, Nat, and I think that a lot of it has to do with what owners understand about these animals' wants and needs, and if they're able to cater to them. There's clearly species that don't adapt well to environments of being an owned companion animal, but we're fortunate in New Zealand that we don't have any exotic so-called pets, thank goodness. We're very lucky about that. But we certainly have species of companion animals that people own that they don't seem to understand what they need. And a key one of those that we see is with rabbits. And rabbits seem to be the forgotten companion animal around the world, actually, not just in New Zealand. And about basic things like what sort of range of nutritional things should we be giving our rabbits? Our rabbits are social animals. They need to be with a compatible companion. They shouldn't be kept alone. They're very easy to train. They need diversity in their life. They need a huge amount of enrichment. You can have very good social contact with your rabbits. What we tend to find is we have a lot of backyard rabbits that are kept out yard and in our gardens and hutches with very, very little interaction. Maybe a child wants to have a pet and a rabbit seems like a low maintenance pet. It's not a low maintenance pet. And the lifespan is much longer than people think, and their requirements and their preventative health care is extensive. And just like how we see a lot of solitary rabbits, we also see a lot of backyard dogs, whether or not they are tethered or just left alone for 12 hours a day while their people are working, their people. And so it's important to match your companion animal with the lifestyle of your owners. So it's not okay to have dogs just left alone on their own as solitary beings in a garden for 12 hours a day. unless perhaps that's something that your dog would actually like. Your dog prefers its own company. But as a general rule, the vast majority of our companion animals are social animals, and so they need to have the appropriate social enrichment that comes along with that, and the appropriate time given. We tend to see with our reptiles and our fish, though, even less of an understanding about what they need. And it's also an area of research that warrants a lot more research, and therefore owner education around what these animals need. People like to get various types of lizards and fish, but actually keeping a fish in a goldfish bowl without being aerated, that is still legal in New Zealand, is absolutely unacceptable. So there's a lot of examples that we see where their needs are just simply not being met, let alone being able to have positive experiences. And so it really depends on matching the right companion animal with the right owners and making sure they've got the right understanding and can meet their needs, and also provide for those animals to experience positive affective states as well.
Thanks, Hania. And Nayo, just sort of picking up on that a little bit further, do you think that there are particular breeds as well as species that really, given that we might not be able to provide them with a good life at this point in time, that we just shouldn't be keeping them, that we should be legislating against the keeping of those as companion animals or classifying them as companion animals?
It's a very provocative way of stating that question about breeds. Because, yeah, I mean, just like many in this audience, I have very strong views about brachycephalic animals. And I think even now we grossly underestimate the impacts of that conformation on their well-being. So I think there is most certainly breeds of animals that we should no longer be facilitating or encouraging or sustaining. In terms of species or taxa, now this is not a numbers game, because I think that these animals are not, and I stand to be corrected, particularly in New Zealand, and but it may be much more of an issue in Australia. But I think that nocturnal animals as pets is a really potentially problematic area. And I on a number of occasions, I've gone to sort of like wildlife sanctuaries or pet shops and seen chinchillas, for example. You know, I can't see that they have any quality of life whatsoever. They sit in these little cages. They're interrupted constantly during the day. Many of them spend, you know, most of their lives in a little box, sheltering from the light or from interruption. And then when they come out at night, they're probably bothering people. So their behavior is really incompatible with the lives that they're living with, the people they're living with. And I would kind of defer to somebody who knows more about this than I do, but would rats fall into that category as well? Because they're primarily nocturnal, aren't they? Anybody want to comment? Fairly adaptable?
Well, I think they seem to be fairly adaptable,
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, normally they'd be most active at night.
Yeah, and the research literature shows that when they're used in research during, you know, off their cycle, so in our daytime, that has pretty significant impacts on the outcomes of the research. So presumably, if we're interacting with them when they're usually sleeping, that may have an impact on their quality of life as well. And that's also quite an issue for nocturnal animals held in zoos and the like, porcupines, kiwi, those sorts of things that may not be on a reverse cycle daylight environment, and therefore might be constantly interrupted by people, you know, making noise or banging on glass in their normal sleeping cycle. So yeah, I'm not sure how much of an issue it is, but I think it's certainly sort of something we should be thinking about for the future.
Yeah, some really good points there. Yes, Bidda.
Oh, well, the issue of nocturnal animals, I completely agree, Nayo, and it marries in with pushes in Australia in particular to try and encourage people within Australia to adopt wildlife as companion animals. So We tend to get sort of pushes every few years here to do this, and the argument is that there's a conservation benefit, that people will become more familiar with these animals and be able to, if you like, have a captive bred population that will somehow assist in conservation. But just about every single Australian marsupial is nocturnal. So, you've already got an issue there in terms of they're very active at night time, not active in the day. How do you deal with that when you're wanting to interact with your companion when you're awake? But the other issue, and it ties in with what Anya was saying too, is that people don't know how to look after them. And we have enough trouble helping people look after the more traditional species that we have in our care, that if we want to expand those groups to others, we're going to run into trouble. And we're also going to run into trouble in terms of veterinary care, because there simply aren't enough specialist vets to be able to provide the information, advice and treatment to be able to expand our range of animals.
Yes, thanks, Bidda. So we're just about at the end of this panel discussion, but I'm going to put you all on the spot because that's what panel facilitators do. I'm going to give you literally a couple of words or a short sentence. That's it, Helen, not more. And I want you to see if you can summarize in that short period of time what you think is the main challenge to companion animals in trying to achieve for themselves a good life.
Can I go first then?
You can go first, Helen.
Okay, understanding them and then educating people about that.
Great, thank you. And Nayo, because you've always gone last.
Yeah, I think I would say something similar, but I think also we live in a society now that is very much about individuals, and I think it's about kind of, I don't know how you do this, but asking people to put the animal first. And that means sometimes you don't get what you want, and sometimes you don't get the animal you might want. And so really, can we stop thinking about ourselves all the time and put the animal first?
That's good. And Susan?
I think the hardest challenge is that animals and humans, we all live in this incredibly complex ecological system where action has a reaction that we don't always anticipate. So it just makes solving these problems so much harder.
Yeah, yeah. Anya?
So sorry, I just had a homeschooling interruption there. Schooling for months, it's awful. I think that the most important thing is to be able to try to understand it from the animal's perspective and really coming at it from an animal-centric view rather than from what we as humans and animal guardians expect from our animals, flipping it around to trying to see it through the animal's eyes.
Thanks, Anya. And Bidda?
Gosh, everyone said everything I was going to say. So maybe my point would be the social life of animals, understanding that we aren't their species, that they gain more from, most animals gain much more from interacting with their own species than they do with us. And we often forget that.
Thank you all very, very much indeed for sharing your thoughts. We could talk about this, as you know, for a long, long time, but hopefully it's given the delegates at the conference a lot of food for thought. And I just hope that this discussion about animal quality of life, particularly in relation to positive aspects of their life, continues on, and we do see a lot more research, as you've all pointed out, to try and understand animals and the world through their eyes. So thank you all very, very much indeed.